June 23rd, 1757. A heavy sky hangs low over Bengal. The air is thick, the ground soaked in monsoon heat. And in the mango groves of Plassey, history waits to turn. 50,000 soldiers stand beneath the banners of the Nawab of Bengal, muskets loaded, cannons primed, confidence unshaken. Across the muddy field, 3,000 men, a handful of British troops and Indian sepoys, hold their line in silence, outnumbered 15-1. No hope, no chance. And yet, by sunset, Bengal, the richest province in India, will belong to them. The world will tilt. An empire will awaken. This is the day an empire was born. But before Plassey, there was Bengal, a land of unthinkable wealth. Its rivers shimmered with trade. Its ports overflowed with ships bound for Arabia, Africa, and Europe. Silks, spices, muslin finer than air itself. The treasures of Bengal flowed through Calcutta like veins of gold. It was said that whoever controlled Bengal controlled the wealth of the East. The British East India Company came as merchants, not conquerors. A company with ledgers, not lancers. But this was no ordinary business. It had its own army, its own navy, its own currency, and its own hunger. A corporation ruled by profit and willing to bleed the world for it. In 1756, a new ruler took the throne of Bengal, Siraj ud-Daulah. Young, proud, barely 20 years old. He saw what the British were doing, building forts, stockpiling arms, fortifying Calcutta without permission. They said it was for defense. But Siraj saw the truth. It was defiance. So he struck first. The Nawab's army stormed Calcutta. The British were driven out, their flag torn down, and what happened next would become legend and horror. The black hole of Calcutta. 146 prisoners. One dark cell. By dawn, only 23 survived. Whether the story was truth or exaggeration did not matter. In London, it became fuel. In Madras, it became vengeance. And for one man, it became destiny. His name was Robert Clive. Once a failed clerk in the East India Company, a man so lost he nearly took his own life. But India had forged him in fire. He reinvented himself as a soldier, daring, brilliant, ruthless. A man who could see opportunity in chaos. A man who believed he was born for greatness. When Calcutta fell, Clive was in Madras. He saw his chance, not just to reclaim a fort, but to seize a kingdom. He marched north with a small army and took Calcutta back within months. Siraj ud-Daulah was forced to sign peace. But Clive wasn't interested in peace. He wanted power, and Bengal's gold could buy all the power in the world. Inside Siraj's court, betrayal was already growing like rot beneath silk. The Nawab's generals and ministers despised him, his arrogance, his suspicion, his cruelty. Among them was one man whose name would echo in infamy, Mir Jafar, commander of the Nawab's own army. Ambitious, resentful, ready to trade loyalty for a throne. And Clive was ready to make the offer. Through secret letters and whispered promises, he forged conspiracy so perfect it could only end in treason. If Mir Jafar betrayed his master on the battlefield, Clive would make him the next Nawab of Bengal. Gold would flow. Titles would follow. Power guaranteed. The deal was struck. The knives were sharpened. And the fate of India was sealed long before the first cannon fired. By June 1757, both armies moved toward the small village of Plassey, a patch of ground on the banks of the Bhagirathi River. The Nawab's camp was vast. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of elephants, lines of cannon stretching into the mist. Clive's force looked like ants before a flood. But numbers mean nothing when half the enemy has already sold his soul. Dawn broke under a sky swollen with rain. Thunder rolled across the horizon. The first shots cracked through the monsoon air, muskets flashing, smoke rising from drenched powder. The Nawab's artillery roared, shaking the earth. But then the rain came harder, torrential, relentless. The Nawab's guns were left uncovered, their powder ruined, silenced. Clive's artillery, shielded beneath tarpaulins, fired back with precision and fury. The Battle of Plassey had begun, and already its outcome was written. From his command tent, Siraj ud-Daulah watched in confusion as his generals hesitated. Mir Jafar stood motionless, his vast reserve untouched. He did not move. He did not fire. He simply watched as his master's army crumbled. On the other side of the field, Clive saw it, the hesitation, the doubt, the fracture. He knew this was the moment. He ordered his men forward. A storm of musket fire tore through the Nawab's ranks. Panic spread, and within hours, the mighty army of Bengal, 50,000 strong, dissolved into chaos. Siraj ud-Daulah fled the field. His destiny, undone not by courage, but by betrayal. By sunset, Plassey belonged to Robert Clive, and with it, Bengal itself. A company of merchants had just conquered a nation. A single afternoon had changed the course of the world, and the first stone of the British Empire had been set in the blood and rain of Bengal. But this was only the beginning, for behind the glory, behind the gold, lay something darker, a web of greed, manipulation, and vengeance that would devour India from within. And as the guns fell silent at Plassey, one question echoed through the monsoon night. How could 3,000 men defeat 50,000? The answer lies not in courage, but in betrayal. Night falls over the plains of Bengal. The guns are silent now. The air still smells of rain and gunpowder. But beneath the calm, the embers of rebellion still burn. For before Plassey, before betrayal turned the tide, there was a ruler, young, proud, and unprepared for the storm that was coming. His name was Siraj ud-Daulah, the Nawab of Bengal, barely 20 years old, born into wealth, raised in splendor, and doomed by both. He had inherited not just a throne, but a kingdom on the edge of collapse. His court was a nest of serpents, nobles fat with greed, generals loyal only to themselves, and a treasury bleeding under corruption. And in the shadows of Calcutta, the British East India Company was growing stronger every day, smiling in diplomacy, scheming in secret. To Siraj, there were guests who had overstayed their welcome. Foreign merchants, allowed to trade by grace of Bengal, now building fortresses like conquerors. He had seen their arrogance, their endless demands, their subtle defiance, and he despised it. They called him impulsive. They called him cruel. But Siraj ud-Daulah saw something that his elders refused to see, that the foreigners were not merchants anymore. They were predators. The British had come for gold, yes, but they would stay for power. He had heard of their wars in the south, of how they had pitted Indian princes against each other, and always, somehow, the company ended up stronger. He swore it would not happen in Bengal. So when he learned that the British had begun fortifying Calcutta, building walls, mounting cannons, and preparing defenses without his permission, he did not hesitate. To him, it was rebellion, an insult to his sovereignty, a challenge that demanded blood. In June 1756, Siraj marched on Calcutta with an army 30,000 strong. The British garrison fled before him, their commander abandoning the city in panic. By the 20th of June, the Union Jack was torn down, and the Nawab's banners flew from Fort William. For one brief moment, Siraj ud-Daulah stood victorious. He believed he had shown the foreigners their place, that Bengal was not to be trifled with. But that night, in the narrow dungeon of Fort William, something happened that would ignite a vengeance beyond anything he imagined. 146 British prisoners were forced into a single airless room, a cell barely 20 feet square. The air turned poison. The screams lasted hours. By morning, only 23 were alive. History would call it the black hole of Calcutta. Whether the tale was true or exaggerated, it did not matter. In London, it became legend, a symbol of barbarity, a wound demanding retribution. And in that wound, Robert Clive would find his destiny. But Siraj did not know this yet. He celebrated his victory, believing the matter closed. He saw the British as defeated traitors who would crawl back to their ships and beg for peace. He did not know that across the sea, in Madras, the East India Company was already preparing its revenge. Robert Clive, the man they called Clive of India, was on his way north, bringing with him not just an army, but an idea that India could be ruled not by kings, but by accountants, not by crowns, but by contracts, not for honor, but for profit. Siraj had inherited a kingdom. Clive commanded a corporation. And soon, their worlds would collide. In Murshidabad, the Nawab's capital, whispers filled the palace halls. The British were coming. The French were arming. The Dutch were watching. Bengal was rich, too rich to be left alone. Siraj felt the ground shift beneath him. His advisers bickered. His commanders plotted. And though his throne was made of gold, it stood on sand. Among those who smiled at his court was Mir Jafar, his commander-in-chief, a man with calm eyes and quiet ambition. Siraj trusted him. He should not have. Mir Jafar had seen the young Nawab's temper, the rages, the public humiliations, the paranoia. He had felt the sting of insult, the shame of being dismissed. And when Clive's envoys came whispering promises of power, of gold, of kingship, Mir Jafar listened. The conspiracy began like a shadow, invisible, silent, spreading across Bengal's elite. Merchants, bankers, generals, all weaving a web of treachery around the young Nawab. By the time Siraj realized his isolation, it was already too late. Meanwhile, Robert Clive was planning something greater than vengeance. He was planning empire. He had returned to India not as a soldier of the crown, but as a servant of the company, a private army for a private cause. But Clive knew that the conquest of Bengal could make him a legend. Its riches could buy influence in London, titles, seats in Parliament. He was playing for history itself. Clive's letters to the conspirators were written in code. He promised Mir Jafar the throne of Bengal. He promised the great bankers of Murshidabad protection. He promised everyone exactly what they wanted, and believed none of them. In his diary, Clive wrote, "Great designs require great deceit." And deceit became his greatest weapon. As the months passed, tension rose like the monsoon tide. Siraj fortified his positions. Clive gathered his allies. Each knew that war was coming. Only one knew it had already been decided. In May 1757, the company's fleet sailed up the Hooghly River. Their banners snapped in the wind. Their cannons gleamed in the sun. They were merchants no longer. They were conquerors. When the Nawab's messengers arrived, Clive received them with calm indifference. He spoke politely, as always. He assured them of peace, as always. But every word was a lie. By June, the British had advanced to the village of Plassey. Siraj's army followed, 50,000 strong, the pride of Bengal. Mir Jafar marched beside him, and behind that polite smile carried the dagger that would end his master's reign. In the days before the battle, Siraj walked through his camp uneasy. He saw his men, proud, restless, uncertain. He looked to Mir Jafar for counsel, and saw only calm. Too calm. That night, Siraj dreamed of thunder, of rain, of betrayal. And when dawn came, the thunder was real. The Battle of Plassey was about to begin. But in truth, it had already been won, not by strength, but by silver. The fate of Bengal had been bought and sold long before the first cannon fired. Siraj ud-Daulah believed he was defending his throne. Robert Clive knew he was taking an empire. And as the first shots echoed across the mango groves, the young Nawab of Bengal could not yet see that he was fighting not just for his kingdom, but for the soul of India itself. Calcutta, 1756. The air was thick with the scent of the Hooghly River and the distant promise of rain. For decades, the British East India Company had called the city their fortress of trade, their golden gateway to the east. Its warehouses overflowed with silks, spices, and silver. Its docks swarmed with ships. Its merchants ruled from desks rather than thrones. But pride breeds blindness. The company had begun to believe it was untouchable, its walls invincible, its influence eternal. They forgot that they stood not in England, but in Bengal. They forgot whose land this truly was. Siraj ud-Daulah had not forgotten. The young Nawab watched their arrogance grow, watched as they fortified Fort William without his consent, as they armed their walls and ignored his orders. To him, it was rebellion dressed as commerce. It was insult made stone. And so, he gathered his army, an ocean of men, elephants, and artillery that rolled like thunder toward the south. His message was simple: the foreigners would learn respect. Inside the British fort, panic reigned. The governor, Roger Drake, was no soldier, only a merchant wrapped in uniform. He hesitated, argued, delayed, until it was too late. The Nawab's army surrounded the city, cutting off escape. The river was blocked. The fields were crawling with men. The siege began. The guns of Bengal roared against the walls of Calcutta, shaking the fort to its foundation. Cannonballs smashed through stone and smoke filled the skies. The defenders were few, frightened, and disorganized. Their leader abandoned them, fleeing to the ships on the river. Those who remained, British soldiers, Indian sepoys, clerks, and civilians, fought on for a hopeless cause. On June 20th, 1756, the walls of Fort William fell. The flag of the company was torn down. Bengal had reclaimed its pride, but victory came with chaos. As Siraj's men stormed through the fort, looters followed, searching for gold, silver, and vengeance. Dozens of British prisoners were captured, officers, merchants, soldiers, and dragged before the Nawab commanders. Some begged for mercy. Others cursed their captors. But there was no plan for prisoners. No one knew where to keep them. So the guards made a fateful choice. They herded the captives into a small cell within the fort's barracks, a narrow, windowless dungeon built for no more than a handful of men. As night fell, the iron door closed behind them. Inside, 146 men were trapped in a space barely large enough for 20. The air was thick, unmoving, suffocating. At first they stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed against each other in the darkness. The heat was unbearable. Sweat poured from their skin. Someone shouted for water, another for air. The guards outside ignored them. The only sound was the clanging of chains and the faint hum of insects beyond the walls. Minutes turned to hours. The air grew hotter, thicker, poisoned by breath and fear. Men began to faint. Others screamed. Some clawed at the stone walls. Others pounded the door until their hands broke. Those near the window gasped for the faintest breeze, but the rest were trapped in a living grave. The night dragged on, endless and merciless. By dawn, when the door was finally opened, the floor was silent. Of the 146 who had entered, only 23 stumbled out alive. The rest lay twisted on the floor, crushed or suffocated in the dark. Whether this tragedy was born of cruelty or confusion, no one knows. But when word reached the British in Madras, and soon London, it became something far greater than an accident. It became a symbol, a legend, the Black Hole of Calcutta. Across the empire, the story spread like fire. Newspapers screamed of savagery. Politicians thundered of vengeance. The East India Company, humiliated and enraged, demanded justice. But among all those who heard the tale, one man heard it differently. He heard opportunity. His name was Robert Clive. At that moment, Clive was far to the south of Madras, already famous for daring victories in the Carnatic Wars. He was clever, audacious, ruthless, and perfectly suited for the dark work ahead. When he read of Calcutta's fall, of the prisoners dead in the Black Hole, he saw not tragedy but destiny. This was his moment. He would reclaim the city. He would avenge the dead, and in doing so, he would carve his name into the foundations of empire. Clive demanded command of the expedition north. The company agreed. He was their only hope. But his plan went far beyond revenge. He knew that Calcutta was not just a fort. It was a beating heart of Bengal's wealth. Whoever controlled it could control the trade of half the East. In December 1756, his fleet sailed from Madras, carrying barely 900 European soldiers and 1,500 sepoys. It was a small force, but Clive's strength was never in numbers. It was in audacity. He landed near the mouth of the Hooghly River and began to march toward Calcutta through storm, swamp, and fever. Every step was a gamble. The Nawab's armies were larger by tens of thousands, yet Clive moved with the confidence of a man guided by fate. By January 1757, his troops stood before the walls of Calcutta once more. The fort that had fallen so easily now faced the wrath of a man who refused to lose. At dawn, Clive unleashed his attack. Cannons thundered, muskets flared, and smoke rolled over the city. The defenders broke within hours. The British stormed the gates, reclaimed their flag, and once again raised the banner of the East India Company over Bengal. Calcutta was avenged. But vengeance was only the beginning. Siraj ud-Daulah, caught off guard by the ferocity of the counterattack, was forced to negotiate. Clive met him face to face, a young Englishman with cold eyes and iron will, standing before a ruler barely his age yet already exhausted by intrigue. They signed a treaty of peace. The Nawab allowed the company to return to its trade, to rebuild its fort, to pretend that the war was over. But both men knew better. This was not peace. It was prelude. In the weeks that followed, Clive began to weave a web of alliances that would strangle Bengal from within. He met secretly with the great bankers of Murshidabad, the Jugget Seths, men who control the flow of silver across the subcontinent. He promised them stability, protection, profit. They listened. He whispered to Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own commander, promising him the throne in exchange for betrayal. Mir Jafar smiled and said nothing, but in his heart the decision was already made. While Siraj celebrated the return of peace, his court was rotting. His generals conspired. His ministers plotted. And the young Nawab, proud and reckless, saw only shadows where there were daggers. He punished the innocent, insulted the powerful, and unknowingly pushed his allies into the arms of his enemies. Meanwhile, Robert Clive wrote to his superiors in Madras, "We have it in our power to make Bengal ours. The moment must be seized." The death of 100 men in the black hole had become the spark of something far greater, a fire that would consume an empire. Within months, the merchants of London would become the masters of India. The East India Company, once a trading venture, would transform into a force of conquest. And all of it began with one night of darkness, one cell of suffocating death, and one man who turned vengeance into destiny. For Siraj ud-Daulah, the storm was only beginning. For Robert Clive, the path to empire had been lit, and for the world, the black hole of Calcutta was no longer just a tragedy. It was a spark that would set history ablaze. Before he became the conqueror of Bengal, before Plassey or empire, Robert Clive was a failure. A quiet clerk in the East India Company's dusty offices, buried beneath ledgers and ink, forgotten by history before he even began to live in it. He was born in 1725 in the English countryside, a restless child with a temper that frightened his family. He fought constantly, rebelled against teachers, and seemed destined for nothing but disgrace. At 17, his family sent him to India to escape his own destruction. They thought he would vanish into the distance and be forgotten. But India did not forget him. When Clive arrived in Madras, the East India Company was not yet a power. It was a business with soldiers, merchants who wore uniforms, accountants who gave orders. Clive sat behind a desk for years, writing numbers he didn't care about, watching the wealth of the East slip through his fingers. He drank too much, gambled, sank into despair. Once, alone in his quarters, he pressed a pistol to his temple and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. He loaded it again. It misfired a second time. Clive stared at the weapon, trembling, and whispered, "Surely I am reserved for something greater." From that moment, he believed himself chosen, not by God perhaps, but by fate. When war came, he left his desk and took up a sword. It was the middle of the Carnatic Wars, the chaos of French and British forces fighting for dominance in India. Clive joined the company's army and rose quickly, not through birth or rank, but through audacity. He led from the front, reckless and brilliant, turning defeat into victory through sheer will. His capture of Arcot, a fortress thought impossible to take, turned him into a legend. With a few hundred men, he held off 10,000 enemies for 50 days. When the French retreated, Clive's name was known from Madras to London. The clerk had become a soldier. The failure had found his purpose. But Clive was never content with mere victory. He wanted control. Power fascinated him, the way it could be bought, bent, disguised beneath contracts and treaties. He saw that India was a land where wealth and weakness coexisted, where ancient empires were dying and new ones were waiting to be born. The British crown did not yet rule India. The company did. And the company cared for nothing but profit. It was a perfect match for a man like Robert Clive, ambitious, calculating, unbound by morality. When the Black Hole tragedy struck in 1756, Clive was already restless in Madras, looking for the next great storm. The fall of Calcutta gave him one. He demanded the command of the expedition north, not out of duty but destiny. To avenge the dead, yes, but also to claim Bengal's riches for himself and the company. He sailed up the coast with his small army, and within months, Calcutta was his again. He negotiated peace with Siraj ud-Daulah, shook his hand, smiled like an ally, and began planning his downfall the same day. Clive understood something few others did, that in India, wars were not always won on the battlefield. They were won in the courts, in secret letters, in the hearts of men who could be bought. He looked at Siraj's court and saw what the young Nawab could not, weakness disguised as loyalty. Mir Jafar, the commander of the Nawab's army, felt humiliated by his master's arrogance. The great bankers of Murshidabad, the Jugget Seths, feared Siraj's temper more than they trusted his rule. Clive approached them one by one, offering the thing they all desired most, security. And in return, he demanded betrayal. The plan was daring, even for Clive. He promised Mir Jafar the throne of Bengal if he turned against Siraj during battle. He promised the bankers that their fortunes would be safe under British protection. He promised London that victory was inevitable. Each promise was a lie, but each served its purpose. Clive was weaving empire not from conquest, but from corruption. He was not merely a soldier, he was a puppeteer. Those who met him described him as calm, polite, and unnervingly confident. He could speak softly while planning ruin. His eyes, they said, never betrayed emotion. He played the game of empire like chess, thinking not of the next move, but the 10 turns ahead. Yet beneath the iron control, there was something darker. Clive carried within him a storm, rage, pride, and the unshakable belief that fate itself had chosen him. He wrote to his wife in England, "I feel as if Providence intends me for some great design." He was not wrong. By early 1757, Clive had positioned himself perfectly. Siraj ud-Daulah believed he had secured peace. The conspirators believed they were about to rule Bengal, and the British in London believed they were about to restore their honor. Only Clive knew the truth, that when the battle came, it would not be a test of courage, but a performance of betrayal. He spent nights studying the terrain near the village of Plassey, walking the fields beneath the mango trees where fate would unfold. He counted every cannon, every soldier, every river crossing. He wrote to his officers, warning them that victory would depend on discipline, not bravery. "We are but a handful," he told them, "but we shall stand like stone, and the enemy will crumble like sand." When his lieutenants questioned the plan, pointing out that they were outnumbered 15-1, Clive did something extraordinary. He called a council of war and put the decision to a vote. Most officers voted to retreat. Clive listened in silence, then walked out into the night. He stood alone under the trees for nearly an hour. When he returned, his face was calm. "Gentlemen," he said, "the majority have declared for retreat. But I, who am responsible for the honor of the nation, cannot in conscience obey them. We shall attack." That night, he wrote in his journal, "The die is cast." It was not arrogance. It was conviction. The conviction of a man who had looked death in the eye and survived, who believed that destiny itself would not allow him to fail. As dawn approached on June 23, 1757, Clive prepared his men for battle. The air was thick with rain and gunpowder. The Nawab's army stretched across the plain, 50,000 strong. The British line was a sliver of red and white amid the green fields. Yet Clive rode among his soldiers with calm command, his words steady, his gaze unshaken. "Remember," he told them, "we fight not for ourselves, but for England and for history." Behind him, Mir Jafar's troops waited in silence, their loyalty already sold. Ahead of him, Siraj's cannons waited to roar. And above them all, the monsoon clouds rolled like the hand of fate itself. In that moment, Robert Clive, the failed clerk, the would-be suicide, the soldier who had risen from nothing, stood at the edge of immortality. Before the sun set, he would defeat an army 20 times the size of his own. He would break a kingdom. He would lay the first stone of the British Empire. But standing beneath the mango trees of Plassey, even Clive could not yet see what that victory would cost. Not to him, not to Bengal, not to the world. The morning of June 23, 1757, dawned heavy and grey over the plains of Plassey. The monsoon clouds hung low, promising rain, but also concealing the storm of history about to unfold. The air smelled of wet earth and tension. In the distance, the Nawab's army stretched across the landscape like an ocean of green and gold, its cannons glinting, elephants poised, thousands of soldiers waiting to crush a force they considered insignificant. Across the muddy fields, a small British force, barely 3,000 strong, stood silent, disciplined, and aware of the impossible task ahead. They were not merely soldiers. They were instruments of destiny, guided by one man who understood that war was as much about treachery as it was about courage. Robert Clive rode along the lines, surveying his men with calm precision. European soldiers, sepoys, and mercenaries adjusted their positions. Cannons were covered and ready. Every man knew the stakes. Clive spoke little, but his presence alone imbued his army with confidence. He knew the secret that the Nawab did not, the ultimate betrayal waiting within the enemy ranks. Mir Jafar, the commander of the Nawab's army, had agreed in secret to withhold support, to let the British strike first and to allow the collapse of Bengal's forces. The plan was set. Betrayal would decide the battle before the first cannonball exploded. Siraj ud-Daulah rode at the center of his army, proud and arrogant, oblivious to the duplicity in his own camp. He believed in the strength of his men, the terror of his elephants, and the inevitability of his victory. He glanced at his commanders, expecting loyalty, but found only hesitant eyes. A shadow passed over his thoughts, a fleeting doubt that he immediately suppressed. He could not conceive that the men he trusted most would turn against him. The first shot shattered the tension. British cannons, carefully protected from the rain, fired with precision. The muskets of Clive's men crackled like thunder. Smoke rolled across the fields. The Nawab's artillery responded, but their powder, dampened by monsoon rain, sputtered ineffectively. Panic began to ripple through the dense ranks. Elephants stampeded. Soldiers shouted. Orders were repeated, then ignored. The battlefield, once a scene of rigid discipline, descended into chaos. In the heart of the Nawab's forces, Mir Jafar's regiments remained stationary, their loyalty sold to the highest bidder. They watched as comrades fell and confusion spread, knowing they would not intervene. Clive, aware of every movement, exploited the hesitation. He sent small detachments to outflank the enemy, to strike at weak points, to amplify the disorder. What should have been an overwhelming force became a fragmented army unable to respond effectively. Siraj's frustration grew. His soldiers faltered. His elephants panicked. The thunder of British cannon seemed to come from every direction at once, and he could not understand why his army did not rally as he commanded. He rode through the ranks, shouting, gesturing, demanding obedience, but Mir Jafar's betrayal had already undermined the chain of command. Orders were ignored. Units retreated without instruction. The young Nawab's pride, once unshakable, faltered. Clive's strategy was simple in its genius. He needed not to destroy every soldier, but to fracture the enemy's morale. A small, disciplined force against a massive army could prevail the opponent crumble from within. And crumble it did. Every hesitant general, every wavering soldier, every loyalist questioning the orders of their leaders contributed to the collapse. By mid-morning, Siraj's forces were no longer a united front. They were splintered, fleeing, and leaderless. The betrayal of Mir Jafar was total. At a critical moment, when the battle could have turned against Clive's outnumbered men, his regiments did not fire. They did not charge. They did not move. The young Nawab's flank was exposed, his center vulnerable, and the British exploited every opening. Cannon fire cut swaths through the enemy, muskets struck with deadly accuracy, and Clive's men moved like a well-oiled machine amidst the chaos. It was a slaughter, but also a demonstration of the power of deception. Siraj's pride was shattered. He could not comprehend the speed of the collapse. He tried to rally his forces, but the tide had already turned. His elephants, once terrifying instruments of war, now ran amok, trampling friend and foe alike. His soldiers abandoned positions, leaving artillery and supplies behind. Within hours, what had seemed an unstoppable army was reduced to fleeing fragments. The decisive moment came when Mir Jafar rode forward under a flag of false allegiance. He confronted Siraj, ostensibly offering support, but in truth sealing the Nawab's fate. Confused and exhausted, Siraj realized too late the depth of the betrayal. His trusted commander had chosen power over loyalty, gold over honor, ambition over duty. The young Nawab's dream of victory died on the fields of Plassey. Clive observed from a slight rise, unmoved by the carnage, yet aware of the magnitude of what had been achieved. 3,000 men had defeated 50,000, not by force of arms alone, but by manipulating the very hearts of the enemy. Betrayal, bribery, and strategic patience had created a victory that seemed impossible, yet undeniable. The British flag rose over Plassey not merely as a symbol of conquest, but as a testament to the ruthless effectiveness of cunning over courage. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Siraj fled the battlefield, retreating to regroup, to strategize, and to salvage what remained of his army. But his retreat was hollow. The British forces pursued strategically, ensuring that remnants of resistance could not organize. Clive's victory was complete. Plassey was not just a military conquest. It was a psychological triumph, a demonstration that loyalty could be bought, that power could be seized through intellect rather than numbers. In the capital of Murshidabad, the news spread quickly. The treasury, the streets, the markets, all were shaken. Mir Jafar was installed as a new Nawab, but his throne was not his own. It was held in trust by the company, by Clive, by the architects of a new order. Bengal had been conquered without a siege, without prolonged destruction, without months of attrition. It had been conquered through careful manipulation, through promises and payments, through betrayal executed with precision. The price of this betrayal, however, was not measured only in gold or territory. It was measured in lives, in trust, in the moral fabric of a nation. Siraj ud-Daulah's reign ended not on the sword but in humiliation. Stripped of allies, betrayed by those closest to him, the Nawab would later attempt to regain his kingdom, but the momentum of empire had shifted irrevocably. The East India Company was no longer merely a trading entity. It was a power capable of determining the fates of kings. Robert Clive, the once failed clerk, now stood at the epicenter of a new world. His reputation soared. London hailed him as a hero. The company expanded its influence, extracting wealth and consolidating power in ways that had once been unimaginable. Plassey had proven that intelligence, patience, and moral flexibility could achieve what brute force alone never could. The foundations of the British Empire in India had been laid not by kings, not by generals, but by a man who understood the machinery of betrayal, the art of politics, and the leverage of human ambition. Yet in the shadows of triumph, the consequences of Plassey lingered. The people of Bengal, the soldiers who fought loyally for Siraj, the thousands who suffered and died, all were swept aside by the tide of empire. The battle was not merely about territory. It was about the transformation of a nation, the restructuring of society, and the redistribution of power on a scale that would resonate for centuries. Every choice made on that field, every betrayal, every act of greed, echoed far beyond the mango groves of Plassey. As Clive rode through the battlefield, surveying the carnage and the abandoned artillery, he knew that this was only the beginning. The victory was monumental, yet fragile. To maintain it required vigilance, cunning, and a continual manipulation of allies and enemies alike. Empire, he understood, was a living entity demanding sacrifice, strategy, and an unwavering will. And so, as the sun set over the plains of Bengal, the small British force that had faced insurmountable odds stood victorious. Mir Jafar ascended to the throne, a puppet of London's merchants. Siraj ud-Daulah lived only as a shadow of the man he had been, betrayed by those he trusted most. And Robert Clive, the man who had once been a failed clerk and near suicide, had transformed the course of history. The impossible had been achieved, not by courage alone, but by the meticulous orchestration of betrayal, ambition, and cold intelligence. Plassey was not just a battle. It was the birth of a new era. It was a price of betrayal, paid in human lives, in honor, and in the destiny of nations. And the world would never be the same. The smoke of Plassey had barely cleared, yet the air over Bengal was thick with more than the scent of gunpowder. It was thick with fear, with awe, and with the first whispers of empire. 3,000 men had defeated 50,000. A kingdom had fallen not to swords, but to cunning, ambition, and betrayal. The victory was absolute. The young Nawab, Siraj ud-Daulah, had fled in disgrace. Mir Jafar, once a loyal commander, now wore the crown, but it was not his crown. It was a crown of the East India Company, draped around a puppet whose strings were firmly in British hands. Robert Clive surveyed the battlefield one last time. The mangled remains of artillery, the scattered muskets, the trampled elephants, all were testaments to a victory that few had thought possible. His men moved quietly among the remnants, tending the wounded, securing positions, ensuring that the fragile triumph would not slip through their fingers. Clive knew that war was only the first step. Empire required more than courage. It required control. It required strategy, patience, and the careful manipulation of those who now sat in seats of power under his influence. In Murshidabad, Mir Jafar took the throne amid pomp and ceremony. He wore the robes of the Nawab, He received the bows of ministers, and he heard the cheers of the citizens, but he knew he was a figurehead. Behind the curtains of power, Clive dictated the terms of rule. Bengal's treasury, its armies, its administration, all were subtly, irrevocably under the influence of the company. The Juggetseths, the great bankers whose wealth had fueled kingdoms for generations, now paid tribute to London's merchants. Every coin of silver, every shipment of rice, every bolt of silk flowed through the channels that Clive had designed. The empire was not yet formalized, not yet recognized by crowns, but it existed. It breathed. It moved. It had been born in a single day, in a single act of betrayal, and now it began to consolidate its power. Clive's genius was not in conquest alone. It was in understanding human nature. He knew that Mir Jafar would never rule without fear. He knew that the Nawab's court would resent his ascendancy. He knew that loyalty was fragile, that ambition could be bought, and that the most powerful weapon of all was control over wealth. Clive ensured that contracts, promises, and payments bound Mir Jafar to him. The Nawab could command armies, yes, but only if Clive allowed it. He could rule a kingdom, yes, but only within the confines Clive drew. Bengal was sovereign only in name. In reality, it belonged to the company. In the weeks following the battle, Clive moved swiftly to secure his hold. He sent envoys to neighboring provinces, warning them of the British presence, negotiating alliances, and ensuring that no local prince could challenge the new order. He restructured the military, placing officers loyal to the company in key positions. He audited the treasury, redirecting funds to stabilize the administration while ensuring that revenue flowed back to London. The consolidation was methodical, deliberate, and ruthless. No stone was left unturned, no opportunity ignored. He was not merely a conqueror, he was the architect of a new political reality. Meanwhile, the young Nawab, Siraj ud-Daulah, had fled to the countryside, seeking allies, attempting to rebuild what remained of his authority. But his efforts were in vain. Word of Mir Jafar's coronation spread like wildfire. Merchants, generals, and nobles pledged allegiance to the new ruler, recognizing that the British controlled the ultimate power behind the throne. Siraj was isolated, abandoned by those he had once trusted. His army, demoralized and scattered, could not rally. His dreams of resistance dissolved beneath the cold logic of Clive's strategy. Clive understood that true power required more than victory on the field. It required perception. The people of Bengal had to believe in the legitimacy of Mir Jafar, even as they felt the invisible hand of London guiding him. Propaganda, ceremony, and spectacle became tools of governance. Governors were appointed, taxes were collected, and the mechanisms of administration continued without disruption. Clive's subtle manipulation ensured that the change of power was nearly seamless, that rebellion was less likely than compliance. He had turned conquest into governance, and governance into empire. Even in the quiet moments, Clive's mind raced. He wrote letters to London, reporting not only on military success but on the possibility for wealth, trade, and further expansion. Every shipment of rice, silk, and silver was accounted for. Every bureaucrat, banker, and general was placed into a system that ensured loyalty and efficiency. The East India Company was no longer a distant mercantile venture. It was a sovereign power, shaping the fate of a nation and laying the foundation for an empire that would endure for centuries. But the consolidation of power came at a cost. The human toll was staggering. Thousands had died at Plassey, and countless more would suffer under the new regime. Siraj ud-Daulah, humiliated and betrayed, would eventually be captured and executed. Mir Jafar would rule as a puppet, his authority dependent entirely on British favor. Families, armies, and communities had been swept aside to make way for a corporate empire. Clive's victory was as much moral conquest as military, and its consequences would echo across generations. Yet for Clive, there was no hesitation. History demanded action, not remorse. He moved through the streets of Murshidabad with purpose, overseeing the installation of new officials, auditing revenues, and ensuring that every element of governance reinforced British control. The people may have feared him, respected him, or hated him, but they could not ignore him. He had become the unseen hand shaping the destiny of a region, the embodiment of an empire in its infancy. In private, Clive reflected on the improbable path that had brought him here. The failed clerk, the near suicide, the audacious soldier. He had transformed himself into a master of strategy, politics, and human nature. He understood that victory was never absolute. It required vigilance, manipulation, and the ability to anticipate every move of allies and enemies alike. Plassey had proven the power of cunning over numbers, of intelligence over force. The empire would grow, but it would always depend on men like him, ruthless, brilliant, and unyielding. By the end of 1757, Bengal was firmly under company control. Fortresses had been rebuilt, armies reorganized, taxes redirected, alliances forged. The victory at Plassey had shifted the balance of power in India irrevocably. What had begun as a single battle had become the blueprint for empire, a combination of military strategy, political manipulation, and economic dominance. Robert Clive had not only won a war, he had redefined the rules of conquest. And yet, even as Clive consolidated his control, the world beyond Bengal watched with caution. European powers took note of the rising influence of the East India Company. India was no longer a patchwork of kingdoms. It was a stage for global ambition. The principles Clive had applied, manipulation of allies, strategic bribery, control of resources, would become standard practice in the decades to come. The seeds of the British Empire had been planted, and they would grow to shape continents, economies, and lives for centuries. The victory at Plassey and the subsequent consolidation of power were more than military triumphs. They were a demonstration of how intelligence, audacity, and the ruthless calculation of human ambition could bend history. Clive had turned a fleeting moment into a permanent legacy. The young Nawab had been overthrown, Mir Jafar crowned, and the company's authority extended across the richest province in India. 3,000 men had achieved what 50,000 could not, through betrayal, strategy, and the cold precision of empire building. As the sun set over Murshidabad, Clive stood atop the palace walls, gazing at the city he had transformed. The rivers glimmered in the fading light. The markets were alive, the fort secure, the banners of the East India Company fluttering in the wind. Empire was not yet complete, but it was inevitable. The impossible had been achieved. The impossible had been secured. The birth of British dominion in India was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. And at its center, Robert Clive remained unshaken, the man who had bent fate itself, turning ambition, betrayal, and cunning into the architecture of power. After Plassey, the young Nawab Siraj ud-Daulah found himself trapped not by the British soldiers on the battlefield, but by the invisible chains of betrayal and political machination. His kingdom, once rich and proud, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Mir Jafar, the very man Siraj had trusted most, now occupied the throne, but his power was hollow. Every decree he issued, every order he gave, depended on the approval of Robert Clive and the East India Company. Bengal had a Nawab in name only. In reality, the company controlled every river, every trade route, every treasury, every cannon. Siraj fled first to the eastern provinces, seeking allies among his former generals and nobles. He sent letters, pleaded for support, promised rewards for loyalty, but the tide had already shifted. The memory of Plassey, of the decisive betrayal, had convinced many that siding with the British was safer than remaining loyal to their sovereign. Even those who wished to resist feared Clive's intelligence network, his ability to anticipate their every move. The young Nawab's army was scattered, demoralized, and exhausted. Siraj realized too late that his reign had been undermined long before the first cannon fired. Mir Jafar's coronation was a spectacle designed to legitimize the new order. The Nawab wore the robes of his ancestors, the ceremonial crown upon his head, the guards of the palace standing at attention. Ministers bowed, the Juggetsets paid homage, the people cheered cautiously. But every gesture of loyalty was orchestrated. Behind the throne, Clive's officers ensured compliance. Key positions in the army were assigned to men loyal to the company. Revenue collection was supervised by British officials. Bengal's political machinery continued to run, but only along the path that Clive and his allies dictated. Clive understood that power without perception was fragile. Mir Jafar had to appear legitimate, respected, and in control, even though he was entirely dependent on Clive. The puppet needed the illusion of authority. The strings had to remain invisible to maintain order. Clive worked tirelessly to cement this balance. Letters were sent to local rulers, treaties renegotiated, alliances formalized. Every act reinforced the supremacy of the company while preserving the semblance of local governance. Meanwhile, Siraj's attempt to regroup ended in betrayal at every turn. Former allies, seeing the inevitability of British dominance, turned against him. Letters were intercepted, messages delayed, spies reported every movement. The young Nawab was forced into hiding, moving from village to village, relying on the loyalty of a few who had not yet succumbed to fear or bribery. Each day of flight was a reminder of the price of trust misplaced, the danger of misjudging ambition. Clive's victory had not only been achieved on the battlefield, it had been extended into every corner of Bengal through espionage, influence, and the careful cultivation of dependence. The fall of Siraj became inevitable. By the autumn of 1757, his position was untenable. He had no army, no allies, no treasury, no escape. Mir Jafar, installed by Clive, sent emissaries offering clemency in exchange for surrender. Siraj, exhausted and betrayed, had no choice. He was captured and brought to Murshidabad under guard, his pride shattered. The streets that once cheered his victories were silent or hostile. The young Nawab, who had once ruled with the confidence of youth and wealth, now faced the reality of his defeat, the human cost of political naivety. Clive oversaw every aspect of this transition. He ensured that Siraj's removal would be seen as a natural consequence of failed leadership rather than British manipulation. To the public, Mir Jafar's rise appeared orderly. The company's influence, though invisible, controlled every detail. Siraj's capture and subsequent execution were carefully timed and conducted to avoid unrest. Clive understood that the psychological impact of power consolidation was as important as a military victory itself. He had turned the defeat of a single man into the demonstration of a new world order. Mir Jafar, in his new position, quickly became aware of his dependence. He could command armies, but only with British guidance. He could levy taxes, but the revenue ultimately flowed to the company. He could make decrees, but every decision had to be approved or facilitated by Clive's network. His throne was a gilded cage, a symbol of authority stripped of real power. Yet outwardly, he maintained the appearance of sovereignty. Clive's brilliance lay in this balance, the illusion of independence masking absolute control. The economic impact of this consolidation was immediate and profound. Bengal's wealth, once flowing to the Nawab and his court, was redirected in part to the East India Company. Trade agreements favored British interests. Key positions in administration and finance were filled with those loyal to Clive. The Jugget Seths, previously autonomous and influential, now operated under the careful oversight of company agents. Clive had effectively merged commerce, politics, and military power into a single, coordinated instrument of control. The empire he was building was corporate, global, and unprecedented in its sophistication. The psychological consequences for the people of Bengal were equally significant. The betrayal at Plassey and the rise of Mir Jafar created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Loyalty was no longer a safe strategy. Survival required adaptability, caution, and often complicity. The social and political order had shifted irrevocably. For centuries, Bengal had been a jewel of wealth and culture. Now, it was a proving ground for the mechanisms of imperial dominance. The choices made by a handful of men, Clive, Jafar, and those who betrayed Siraj, had reshaped the fate of millions. Through all this, Clive remained focused, calculating, and unflinching. He was aware that victory was never permanent without vigilance. He maintained networks of spies and informants, kept Mir Jafar in check through subtle pressure, and ensured that any potential rivals were neutralized through diplomacy or intimidation. Empire, he understood, was not a static achievement. It was a dynamic system, requiring constant attention and management. Plassey had given him the foothold, now he would extend it. As Bengal adjusted to this new order, the implications for India and the wider world became clear. The East India Company was no longer just a trading entity. It had become a sovereign force capable of shaping kingdoms, installing rulers, and directing the flow of wealth. The defeat of Siraj ud-Daulah and the rise of Mir Jafar were more than historical events. They were the blueprint for the emergence of British imperial control across the subcontinent. Clive's actions demonstrated that conquest could be achieved through intelligence, treachery, and strategy as much as through battlefield heroics. By the end of 1757, Bengal was firmly under British influence. The Nawab sat on the throne, but the company controlled the strings. The treasury flowed toward London. Trade routes were secured. Political rivals were neutralized. The first act of British imperial domination in India had been completed, and it had been achieved not by numbers alone, but by the meticulous orchestration of loyalty, fear, and ambition. Clive had not only changed the course of a kingdom, he had changed the course of history. The fall of Siraj and the rise of Mir Jafar marked the transformation of power itself. The Nawab's fate was sealed not by brute force but by strategy, insight, and the careful exploitation of human ambition. Robert Clive had turned the impossible into reality, proving that a small, determined, and cunning force could bend the destiny of a vast empire. Bengal was no longer free. The company's influence had been cemented, and the world would never be the same. With Plassey behind him and Mir Jafar firmly enthroned under British guidance, Robert Clive turned his gaze outward. Victory at Plassey had secured Bengal, but the East India Company's ambitions extended far beyond a single province. The subcontinent was a mosaic of kingdoms, each with wealth, influence, and armies. The lesson of Plassey was clear. A small, disciplined force, guided by cunning and strategic manipulation, could bend entire regions to its will. Clive understood this and intended to exploit it. The months following the installation of Mir Jafar were spent consolidating power, stabilizing the administration, and ensuring loyalty through a combination of bribes, intimidation, and careful appointments. Company officers were placed in key positions of influence. Tax collection was reorganized to favor British trade networks. Local rulers, sensing the shift in power, were courted, coerced, or neutralized. Bengal, once a prosperous and independent province, now became the foundation of an empire in the making. The company's reach extended beyond trade. It began to control resources, armies, and the flow of wealth. Clive's strategy was multifaceted. He understood that force alone could not maintain dominance. Diplomacy, deception, and economic control were as critical as muskets and cannons. He cultivated alliances with influential bankers like the Jugget Seths, ensuring that the financial lifeblood of the region supported British interests. Merchants and nobles were persuaded or bribed to cooperate. Mir Jafar's authority was maintained as long as he obeyed the instructions of his foreign overlords. Every action reinforced the perception of local sovereignty while cementing real control in British hands. Beyond Bengal, the political landscape was shifting. The French, previously a major power in India, had suffered defeats in the Carnatic Wars and were weakened. Their strongholds in the south offered limited resistance to a determined company. Clive seized on this moment of vulnerability, extending influence into neighboring territories through a combination of military intimidation and political negotiation. The story of Plassey became a blueprint, a demonstration of how alliances could be bought, loyalty manipulated, and overwhelming odds overcome through strategy rather than sheer force. The East India Company's reach grew not through conquest alone, but through economic leverage. Trade monopolies were established, taxes were redirected to favor British commerce, and infrastructure, roads, ports, warehouses, was developed to facilitate control. The company effectively became a state within a state, blending commercial and political power in ways the subcontinent had never seen. Clive's genius was an understanding that wealth and governance were inseparable. Control over one ensured dominance over the other. Meanwhile, the cultural and social fabric of Bengal began to feel the weight of this new order. The local population, previously accustomed to autonomous governance, witnessed the imposition of foreign authority. Traditional power structures were manipulated or dismantled. Loyalty to Mir Jafar was tempered by fear of the British. The economy, once locally driven, now funneled resources toward British interests. Clive's victories were not measured solely in territory, but in influence, control, and the reshaping of society to serve imperial goals. Clive also recognized the importance of intelligence. Spies and informants were positioned throughout Bengal and neighboring regions. Every movement of potentially hostile rulers or rebellious factions was monitored. The Battle of Plassey had taught him that knowledge was as powerful as gunpowder. Anticipation and preemption became the backbone of company strategy. By controlling information, Clive ensured that uprisings could be suppressed before they gathered momentum, and that every political maneuver favored British interests. Mir Jafar, despite holding the title of Nawab, quickly became dependent on Clive for survival. His legitimacy rested on British approval. His wealth depended on company-controlled revenues, and his military power was supplemented and overseen by British officers. The Nawab's throne was gilded, but it was a cage. Clive maintained his delicate balance with precision, rewarding compliance, punishing defiance, and ensuring that the illusion of sovereignty never faltered. Through this, the company demonstrated a revolutionary model of indirect rule, control without overt conquest, dominance without constant warfare. The expansion of company influence was not confined to politics and economy. Clive understood the symbolic power of presence. Forts were strengthened and garrisoned. Banners were displayed, and patrols maintained visibility throughout the region. Every town, river crossing, and trade route was subtly integrated into the British network. The people of Bengal and surrounding provinces came to understand that power had shifted. Resistance was possible but perilous. Compliance became the rational choice, and loyalty to the company became the key to survival. Clive's methods would become standard for future operations across India. Plassey and its aftermath demonstrated that conquest could be achieved not only through battles but through strategy, economic manipulation, and psychological control. The model was clear. Small, disciplined forces, guided by intelligence and political cunning, could dominate vast territories and reshape entire societies. The principles applied in Bengal were soon tested and replicated elsewhere, laying the groundwork for the largest empire in modern history. By the end of 1758, the company had solidified control over Bengal, ensured the loyalty of Mir Jafar, and extended influence into neighboring provinces. Trade flourished under British supervision. The wealth of the region, once controlled by local rulers, now flowed to company coffers, funding further expansion. The military and administrative apparatus established by Clive created a framework that would sustain British power for decades. Bengal had become both a symbol and a practical foundation of empire, a demonstration of what strategy, intelligence, and calculated ruthlessness could achieve. Clive himself became legendary. Letters to London detailed not just military victories, but the consolidation of political and economic power. The company, once seen as a trading enterprise, was now recognized as a formidable political force capable of shaping nations. Clive's personal reputation soared. He was celebrated as a strategist, a visionary, and the man who had turned a single battle into the first step of a global empire. Yet beneath the triumph lay the cost. Thousands had died at Plassey. Millions would feel the effect of the new order, and the social structures of Bengal had been irrevocably altered. The victory was absolute, but it was also the birth of a complex, often brutal system of control. Empire was not merely about conquest. It was about managing human ambition, loyalty, and fear on an unprecedented scale. Clive had mastered this art, ensuring that British rule in India would endure, adapt, and expand. As the sun set over the rivers and plains of Bengal, the East India Company's power was no longer theoretical. It had a foothold, a network, a system of control that extended beyond walls and fortresses into the very life of the province. Mir Jafar remained on the throne, Clive's invisible hand guiding every decision. The lessons of Plassey had been applied, perfected, and institutionalized. 3,000 men had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the subcontinent, and the world would never be the same. Empire, Clive understood, was only beginning. The conquest of Bengal was the seed. Its expansion would follow through diplomacy, strategy, and, when necessary, ruthless force. Every alliance, every contract, every payment reinforced a new order. The impossible had been achieved at Plassey. Now the challenge was to sustain it, to grow it, and to transform a fleeting victory into lasting dominion. And so, with Bengal firmly under British influence and the mechanisms of power established, Robert Clive prepared for the next phase, the expansion of company rule across the subcontinent. His vision was clear, not merely to win battles, but to govern, to control, and to bend the destiny of nations to his will. The era of British India had begun, and Plassey was only the first chapter. The plains of Bengal were quiet now, but the silence carried a weight heavier than cannon fire. Plassey had ended. Mir Jafar ruled under the guidance of Robert Clive, and the East India Company's control extended across the richest province in India. Yet the victory had cast a long shadow. The promise of empire was as intoxicating as it was dangerous, and the consequences of conquest began to ripple through every corner of the land. The people of Bengal, once loyal to their Nawab, now navigated a world transformed. Merchants who had flourished under Siraj ud-Daulah now submitted to British oversight, their fortunes dependent on compliance. Landowners, previously autonomous, were pressured to pay taxes that ultimately enriched a foreign power. Soldiers who had fought bravely found themselves bound to a new regime, their loyalty questioned, their authority undermined. Every action, every decision, was filtered through the lens of British influence. The shadow of empire was not a distant threat. It was immediate, pervasive, and unyielding. Robert Clive understood this better than anyone. Victory on the battlefield was fleeting. Power, to endure, required vigilance, manipulation, and control. He deployed agents throughout Bengal to monitor both allies and potential adversaries. Every letter was read, every report scrutinized. The flow of wealth, the movement of armies, the allegiance of local rulers, nothing escaped the scrutiny of the company. Clive's brilliance was not merely in winning battles. It was in creating a system that ensured those victories translated into lasting dominance. Mir Jafar, installed as Nawab, was acutely aware of his dependence. His throne, once a symbol of independent authority, was now a gilded cage. Clive controlled appointments, military decisions, and the flow of revenue. Even the display of pomp and ceremony required British approval. The illusion of sovereignty remained, carefully preserved for the public, but every gesture of authority was dictated by the man who had orchestrated Plassey. The Nawab was both ruler and prisoner, a figurehead whose survival depended on obedience. The consequences of Plassey and Clive consolidation extended beyond politics into society and economy. The British demanded revenues that had previously remained in local hands. Trade routes were reorganized to favor company interests, and taxes were directed to fund British operations. Every transaction, from silk and spices to rice and silver, reinforced the emerging imperial network. Bengal's wealth flowed outward, feeding a system that had once been unimaginable. The company was no longer a trading venture. It was the engine of empire. Yet control required more than wealth and loyalty. It demanded perception, discipline, and fear. Clive ensured that the people understood the new order, that resistance was costly, and that compliance was rewarded. Rebels were dealt with swiftly, and subtle intimidation reminded all who ruled that the company's reach was vast. Victory had been won on the battlefield, but dominance would be maintained through strategy, manipulation, and psychological power. The shadow of empire extended into every market, every court, every village. The implications for neighboring kingdoms were immediate. The story of Plassey, of a small British force defeating a massive army, spread rapidly. Local rulers, witnessing the collapse of Siraj ud-Daulah's forces and the installation of a puppet Nawab, reconsidered their alliances. Some sought to align with the company, hoping to preserve power under British favor. Others plotted rebellion, unaware of the intelligence network already in place to thwart them. Clive's victory had sent a clear message. The British could conquer not just through force, but through influence, manipulation, and precision. The psychological impact on the broader population was profound. Loyalty became a dangerous gamble. The line between friend and foe blurred as everyone assessed the consequences of allegiance. The betrayal at Plassey became a cautionary tale, a lesson in fragility of trust and the power of ambition. Families, communities, and armies all recalibrated their understanding of authority and survival. The shadow of empire was invisible yet tangible, shaping decisions, behaviors, and destinies across Bengal. Clive, ever vigilant, extended this influence beyond immediate politics. He reorganized the military, ensuring that company forces could respond to any rebellion. He oversaw infrastructure, trade, and administration, creating a system that made British control self-sustaining. Every action reinforced a hierarchy. The Nawab appeared sovereign, but the company directed every critical decision. This model of indirect rule, subtle yet absolute, would become the foundation of British strategy across India. Even as Clive strengthened the company's grip, he recognized the fragility of power. Empires, he knew, could rise quickly, but they could also fall. He cultivated alliances carefully, measured every promise, and ensured that fear and loyalty coexisted. The shadow of empire was not maintained through conquest alone. It required constant attention, strategic foresight, and the ability to manipulate the ambitions of men. Clive's genius lay in understanding that influence, not just force, determined the permanence of power. The fall of Siraj and the rise of Mir Jafar illustrated this principle perfectly. One man's betrayal had reshaped the kingdom. One battle had altered the trajectory of nations. Yet the ongoing consolidation showed that empire was more than a single act. It was a continuous process of control, persuasion, and governance. The East India Company's influence now extended into daily life. Commerce, taxation, administration, and law were all subtly guided by British authority. The people of Bengal were subjects not merely of a Nawab, but of a corporation turned sovereign power. As the months passed, Clive's control over Bengal became increasingly institutionalized. The company's presence was everywhere, yet invisible to the casual observer. Forts were garrisoned, trade monitored, officials supervised. Political alliances were managed with precision. Mir Jafar ruled, but his independence was an illusion. The shadow of empire was absolute, extending into every action, every decision, every aspect of governance. Clive had transformed a fleeting military victory into a permanent system of domination. The success of this model resonated beyond Bengal. Other provinces, kingdoms, and rulers took note of the British approach. The combination of strategic military engagement, political manipulation, and economic control became a template for expansion. Plassey was not just a battle, it was a blueprint. Clive had demonstrated that a small, disciplined, and cunning force could achieve what armies 20 times its size could not, and that the true power of empire lay in influence and foresight rather than mere numbers. Yet the shadow of empire carried costs. Thousands had perished at Plassey. Millions now lived under a system designed to extract wealth and enforce loyalty. The social fabric of Bengal was irrevocably altered. Communities adjusted, sometimes reluctantly, to the new order. Traditions were disrupted. The influence of the Nawab diminished. The East India Company had created not only a new political hierarchy, but a new societal reality. Clive's triumph was both monumental and profound, shaping the lives of countless individuals. By the end of 1758, the East India Company had transformed Bengal into a stronghold of British influence. Mir Jafar sat on the throne, outwardly powerful but utterly dependent on Clive. Trade, taxes, and administration flowed through British channels. Military power, previously the domain of local rulers, was now supplemented and supervised by company officers. Plassey had been the spark, the consolidation of power, the control of wealth and governance, and the pervasive influence of the company were the shadow it cast. Robert Clive, the man who had once been a failed clerk, now stood at the center of an empire in the making. His genius lay not only in battlefield tactics, but in the orchestration of human ambition, loyalty, and fear. He had turned a single victory into an enduring system of control. The shadow of empire extended across Bengal and beyond, a silent yet omnipresent force shaping the destiny of nations. And as night fell over the rivers and fields of Bengal, the shadow stretched farther still. Empire was no longer a possibility, it was reality. The East India Company had learned the art of domination, and Robert Clive had become its master. Bengal would never be the same, and neither would the world. June 23, 1757, became more than a date in a calendar. It became a turning point, a fulcrum on which the fate of nations pivoted. The Battle of Plassey was over, the mango groves soaked with rain and blood, yet its echoes would reverberate for centuries. 3,000 British soldiers had defeated 50,000, not by sheer force, but by cunning, manipulation, and the ultimate betrayal of a trusted ally. Robert Clive had proven that ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness could bend the destiny of empires. The immediate consequences were staggering. Siraj ud-Daulah, once a powerful Nawab, was dead or displaced, a tragic reminder of how loyalty could be shattered by greed and fear. Mir Jafar sat upon a throne gilded with the illusion of power, yet his reign depended entirely on Clive and the East India Company. Bengal's wealth, its administration, and its military now flowed through British hands. The company, a trading enterprise mere decade before, had transformed into a political and economic powerhouse capable of reshaping entire nations. But the legacy of Plassey was more than territorial or economic. It was a blueprint for empire. It demonstrated that domination could be achieved through strategy as much as through strength, through intelligence as much as through numbers. A small, disciplined force, guided by vision and cunning, could bend the ambitions and loyalties of thousands, even tens of thousands. Clive's genius lay not in the size of his army, but in his understanding of human nature, the fragility of trust, the allure of wealth, and the power of fear. Across Bengal, society began to feel a profound impact of this new order. Merchants, soldiers, and nobles adjusted to the reality of British oversight. Trade, once locally controlled, now fed the coffers of London. Taxes enriched the company rather than local rulers. Traditional power structures were disrupted. The consequences of Plassey reached every corner of daily life. The empire cast a long shadow, one that extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping culture, economy, and governance. Globally, the effects were no less profound. The East India Company's triumph at Plassey signaled the emergence of a new kind of imperial power, one that could blend commerce, politics, and military might into a single, unstoppable force. Other European powers watched carefully, realizing that the rules of engagement had changed. Britain had proven that a trading company could wield authority greater than kings, that wealth and strategy could achieve what armies and crowns sometimes could not. Robert Clive's personal legacy was equally monumental. The failed clerk, once close to despair, had become the architect of an empire. His name would be remembered in London and Calcutta alike, celebrated as a hero by some, condemned as a manipulator by others. Yet history would judge him by the magnitude of his achievement. The transformation of a single victory into enduring domination, the orchestration of events that reshaped a continent. He had turned betrayal into strategy, cunning into power, and ambition into empire. And yet, beneath the triumph, a darker truth remained. Plassey was not a glorious conquest alone. It was a human tragedy. Thousands had perished, countless lives had been uprooted, and a kingdom had been fundamentally altered. The price of empire had been paid in blood, loyalty, and trust. The Battle of Plassey was a testament not only to strategic brilliance but also to the ruthlessness of history, where personal ambition and greed could alter the fate of millions. The world that emerged from Plassey was forever changed. Bengal became the cornerstone of British India, a model of indirect rule, economic exploitation, and political control. Clive's methods, combining diplomacy, espionage, and selective force, would define British strategy for decades. The company's dominance in India would expand, shaping trade, governance, and society across the subcontinent. Plassey was not merely a battle, it was the birth of modern imperialism. As the sun set over the fields where 3,000 men had faced 50,000, the true scale of the event became clear. History had been altered, civilizations reshaped, and power redefined. Robert Clive had done more than win a battle. He had opened the door to an empire, laying the foundation for centuries of global influence. The mango groves of Plassey would never forget the day when human ambition and cunning outmatched the mightiest armies, and the world would never be the same. Plassey was a moment frozen in time, a convergence of fate, treachery, and genius. It was a story of the impossible made real, of small numbers defying overwhelming odds, and of a single man turning the machinery of history to his will. The legacy of that day endures not only in history books, but in the very structures of power and empire that followed. Every palace, every trading post, every treaty in the decades after bore the imprint of what had happened in those mango groves. And so, the Battle of Plassey remains a testament to ambition and cunning, to betrayal and strategy, and to the way individual choices can ripple across the world. It is a story of empire born not only from soldiers' courage, but from intellect, manipulation, and the relentless pursuit of power. It is a reminder that history can pivot on a single afternoon on the actions of a handful of men, and on the courage, or treachery, of those who dare to seize destiny. Plassey was a beginning. It was the dawn of an empire that would span continents. It was the moment when the impossible became inevitable. And at the heart of it, Robert Clive stood, victorious, unyielding, and forever etched into the annals of history.